Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Marbella from NEDIC, and we're coming to you live from the NEDIC offices here in Toronto, Ontario. Just a reminder, if you're having trouble hearing or seeing us, just type a little message into the chat box below, and we'll do our best to fix everything for you. Okay, so in preparation for Eating Disorder Awareness Week on February 1st through 7th, NEDIC is thrilled to partner with one of our neighboring organizations and present Debbie Berlin-Romalis, the new Executive Director at Sheena's Place. Debbie has been practicing as a social worker and psychotherapist since 1991. She's done considerable agency work in various women's shelters and community-based services. In addition to her private work, Debbie practiced clinical social work in the Division of Hematology Oncology at the Hospital for Sick Children from 1998 to 2014, working with children and their families in the stem cell transplant program and the pediatric brain tumor program. She's facilitated groups for women with eating disorders and body image issues at Sheena's Place since 1998. From 1998 to 2008, Debbie was a member of the Health Sciences Review Committee for Bioethics and Research at the Faculty of Medicine, University of Toronto. In 2003, she was appointed as an adjunct practice lecturer at the Faculty of Social Work in the University of Toronto. An active public speaker, she's presented at numerous conferences, including TEDx Toronto 2013. If you have any questions for Debbie during the presentation, please type them into the box in the chat room, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Debbie.
Thanks, Marbella.
You're welcome.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here to share with you some of my clinical experiences from Sheena's Place. I've been a facilitator at Sheena's Place. This will be my 17th year. I'm new to the role of executive director, but it's an honor and privilege to be providing leadership to this wonderful, incredible, one-of-a-kind organization. So we have lots to cover. I'm going to dive right in. And as Marbella said, please don't hesitate to type in your questions. And there will be time at the end of the presentation to answer them. So just to let people know about Sheena's Place, who we are, for those of you who are new to hearing about Sheena's Place, we provide support to all people who are affected by eating disorders. But that also includes family members, friends, partners, employers, and really our mission is to inspire hope, reduce stigma, always raise awareness, and offer meaningful help at all stages of recovery. So there are people who come to Sheena's Place for having just first acknowledged that they have disordered eating or they have some serious health issues that are affecting their physical and their mental health. And so our vision is to ensure that we support and educate and to promote awareness and hope for recovery at all stages and for anyone and everyone affected by eating disorders. I want to introduce Alice to you, and this is taken from an incredible piece of literature called Moving Away from Diets. Please note that all references are going to be, you can find them at the end of the presentation. And I want to talk a little bit about this incredible person because this is a very significant piece of education that I provide when I'm doing my teaching in a group that I have been facilitating at Sheena's Place for over 10 years called Ways to Stop Binge Eating. So I'm going to take you through this chart and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of why diets go wrong. It's important to note, and this is education that is promoted by pioneers in this field, Dr. Gail McVeigh, Dr. Blake Woodside, Dr. Alan Kaplan, Dr. Debbie Katzman, and they will all attest to the significance of this chart, explaining that over 95% of girls at some point will experiment with dieting. The ones that we need to worry about are the ones that turn it into a full-blown career. So Alice finds that eating is calming and this becomes a coping mechanism. Number two, I want to highlight to you is important because when you pair eating as calming as a coping mechanism and you combine that with significant family dysfunction, I want to highlight here that not all people who experience disordered eating come with dysfunctional family issues. I want to highlight here that it could be a traumatic life event that involves abuse. It could involve your family immigrating from a country and English being your second language. It could mean not having great support when you've been diagnosed with a physical health issue. It's really about the experience and the interpretation of the adverse life event and or the traumatic event and or the dysfunction combined with eating as calming that creates a problem. Moving to how you see here, number 3, Alice feels emotional pain and anxiety. She eats, and this causes the cyclical relationship with eating around how you start to feel the relief. But we know that there's more stress because our lives bring more stress. There's more emotional pain. And number 6, this is where eating becomes a core coping mechanism. Number 7 is very significant because what I teach at Sheena's place is that there's an increase in non-hunger eating, which equals weight gain. Because what happens is when we use food as a way to cope, we lose a sense of our hunger cues and our cues around experiencing fullness or feeling satiated. Okay, which is why often people with disordered eating, they don't know when they're hungry and they don't know when they're full. So number 8, enter all individuals who consider themselves to be overweight. And I want to really highlight here for number 8 that this is a very subjective experience. Okay? That yes, there are definitely clinical definitions of what overweight means, but we certainly at Sheena's place work with a lot of people who are clinically underweight but see themselves as overweight. So at the end of the day, it's about the lived experience of the person. Number 9 is very, very important to understand because when someone starts on this journey of having an eating disorder, there is such a huge experience of shame. And that becomes a very intolerable emotion. People don't want to feel shame 24 hours a day. It's bad enough if you feel it for 5 minutes. So to get out of this, look how Alice promises herself that if I go on a food plan, I'll become lovable and everything will be okay. This is very common. I see it in high school students and I see it in university students that to get rid of these feelings of shame and or pain and to start to feel control, this is where the diet kicks in because the diet somehow becomes this magical answer. And herein starts the diet. I often joke about how, notice her, determination and her little stick hand figures on those non-existent hips. And so we move to number 13. The dichotomy of good foods and bad foods increases significantly. Anytime anyone starts to engage in dieting behavior, this is a very common experience. Okay? Good food, bad food. Moving to more emotional pain, because Alice is starting to understand on some level that the diet isn't taking care of her emotional and chaotic feelings. More anxiety. Eats more to alleviate the anxiety, feels the relief, and I want to say here that the relief is temporary, and here more shame. Now, see how number 9, ideally, we would like it if Alice could experience support and understanding and validation and acceptance when she's feeling these shameful feelings and really struggling around preoccupation with weight and dieting. But because it is often so difficult for people to reach out to others, and because there is that internalized sense of shame and experience of stigma that accompanies a lived experience of an eating disorder, it becomes a cycle that often doesn't have an end, resulting in more shame. And then we move to Alice feeling so desperate, and she wants to rescue herself from this pain and this shame. And here is number 17. I cannot emphasize these words enough. She looks outside of herself for the answer. And one of the things we try to teach at Sheena's place is that the answer is actually inside of all of us. But we're told that we can't rely on ourselves for the answer, so that we need to look outside of ourselves in a diet, in a piece of clothing, in a material object. For some people, it's plastic surgery. You get the picture. But look, Alice says a new diet, a stricter diet. And we see the obsession increase. And as we know, life stressors increase, as does the emotional pain. So her core pain is not being attended to by this diet solution. Food plus deprivation, okay, which is really a lethal combination. And here we have it, as happens with most diets, because they are designed to fail, is the binge. And again, this is a tool, a teaching tool that I use when I try to describe the cycle of dieting leading to binge eating. So we now say, okay, she's regained this lost weight. Alice is struggling with self-loathing, self-distrusting, has little insight into her core issues and her eating patterns, and where does she go? And this is where I look to our clients and I say she comes to Sheena's place, because that can be the beginning of a different part of the journey. Now I'm going to move into some of the narratives that I like to share with my groups. These are trademarked phrases that I've developed over time based on the stories and the lived experiences of men and women who come to Sheena's place to talk about the very things that they live with that influence the drive to the eating disorder. But I've also come to understand that there are some key developmental issues that also affect one's development of an eating disorder. So what's juicy love? What does that mean? So over the years, I've developed this recipe, and I see it as a recipe for healthy and resilient child raising. And I also, it takes into account some of the dynamics that happen in this recipe, that when we're missing certain ingredients, there are consequences that happen as a result of not having a juicy and loving environment. So to further delineate this, and I also want to add here that some of these experiences are also based on my work at Sick Kids, where I worked with children and teenagers for many years in a very different population, not eating disorder. They were kids with cancer, but they taught me a lot about adverse life events and what can actually happen when children are raised in very safe, loving, and secure environments. So when you think about kids, and when you think about raising them in, and I want to state here that you can be a biological parent, you can be a non-biological parent, you can be a grandparent. At the end of the day, it's about who are the people in a child's life who are promoting predictable, safe, and consistent living environments. Okay? So this is the definition of predictability. Okay? Children need predictability. They need to know what's coming. So for example, my 8-year-old daughter knows that she goes to bed at the same time and she wakes up at the same time, and meal times are usually at the same time of day, and snacks happen at a certain time at school, and she knows what to expect with her course curriculum, even though she's only 8. And this predictability creates comfort. Now, kids may roll their eyes and go, oh, I have to go to that class again. But it is a pillar of safety in children's lives. Predictability needs to be matched up with consistency. So not only do kids need to predict what's coming, it needs to happen on a regular basis. Okay? So they need to trust that their primary caregivers are exhibiting consistent behavior in their day-to-day. And that includes teachers, and that includes friends. And again, I cannot overemphasize how important these things are in a child's life. One of the things that I saw at Sick Kids was you can have a very organic illness, but when you help to build in a routine for children that involves old habits and old routines that they had at home, like school and some form of exercise and meal times, and they actually see a schedule on their board in their hospital room, it provides them with a sense of relief. So these are primary ingredients. Building on consistency and predictability, John Bowlby was one of the pioneers in child development and attachment theory. He wrote an incredible piece of literature called A Secure Base, really highlighting the different relationships that children have with their caregivers, and it can be ambiguous, it can be ambivalent, or it can be secure based on these consistent and/or predictable messages. So when I think about juicy love, I also think about how a child's entire olfactory system is being activated. Juicy love is literally when you take a baby, a child, a teenager, even if they're being as challenging as all get out, and we give them affection and love and positive messages and hugs and kisses, and even if they push you away, chances are they still really like it. And you're hearing it, you're experiencing it, you're seeing it, you're feeling it, you're smelling it. It's a whole mind-body experience. That's not to suggest that home environments can't be strict. And again, it's not to suggest that home environments can't have rules and consequences, especially when kids aren't meeting certain guidelines or aren't following the rules of a household. But when I talk about juicy love, I'm really trying to indicate here that it's something that is really felt on a very deep level. It also involves having fun. It incorporates kids being out in the world in any capacity. It doesn't have to be an ocean. It can be your backyard. It can be a park. But a way where they get to experience the world, seeing it through their own eyes and sometimes through yours. It's also about having safe friendships so that when kids are out in the world, they learn to experiment with people their own age around some of the dynamics that they're living at home. And it's also about comfort and interacting with nature. Kids love their pets. This is something that I also see quite a bit of in terms of people who've lived through traumatic experiences, how different therapeutic modalities can be brought in to really provide safe and nurturing environments. I want to raise one thing here in relation to juicy love. This is another piece of literature. I'm holding it up because I didn't include it in my references. This is written by someone, his name is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he is a leader in the field of trauma. And this is his latest book called The Body Keeps the Score, which really highlights some clinical experiences of people who don't experience juicy love. That's actually I'd say an understatement, but talks about the sequelae and the consequences that result from people who live from adverse life events. And we certainly know in the literature when it comes to the development of eating disorders that when there's an absence of predictable, consistent, safe environments, and there is an onset or recurrent traumatic events, we can definitely see people struggling with maintaining equilibrium. And I would say that this is replete in literature involving addictions, and we certainly see it with eating disorders as well. So just to give an end note to this concept of juicy love, I really do see it as a formula in terms of shaping and building well-adjusted and resilient children, regardless of their life experiences, that when we provide consistent, predictable, secure bases and allowing kids to safely take risks, explore their environments and their relationships and their friendships, also making sure that they have an opportunity to come back to their secure base for positive reinforcement, we really see a positive evolution in the growth and development of children, which then allows them to literally take off like a rocket ship. Margaret Powell, who is a very, I would call her a seasoned veteran and a highly trained and experienced therapist, I remember her telling me years ago, you know, Debbie, raising a child and helping them reach young adulthood, it's not about how loved they are. It's important, but what's really critical is that we are giving them the life skills and tools to be properly and adequately launched into young adulthood. And that involves having certain life skills and life experiences to rely on. So now I'm moving into my second concept that I do some work on at Sheena's place, and it's called busted radar. So I'm going to jump right in and explain to you what that means. When you think about radar, and you think about animals, and you think about people, or you think about insects, we are all born with this perfect, intact antenna, like you see here. These are our instincts. My experience of seeing busted radar with people takes place when in the brain, often with people who've been traumatized. And they have this experience of what I call busted radar. And I'll explain, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really talk about what actually happens in the different lobes of the brain. But what I can tell you from a psychosocial perspective is that if people do not receive proper help and treatment in the recovery from a traumatic incident, then what happens is our antennae, our radar, stops working properly. Because, and that's not to suggest that it can't be repaired, but one of the things that I've certainly seen in my experience working in women's shelters and working with some of these people at Sheena's place is that if you've never received proper help or intervention or guidance from a traumatic life event, then it can really have permanent damage. I want to explain to you a little bit more about radar. You see, children, for example, have beautiful radar. They communicate it in many different ways. So let's say I'm using a little girl, let's say her name's Sarah, and she's 6 years old, and every Christmas she goes home to her family's house, but she knows that Uncle Billy's going to be there. And she doesn't really like Uncle Billy because his behavior isn't appropriate when he starts to drink alcohol. And so imagine that lived experience and her trying to approach different adults in her life who are supposed to be safe and trusting and says to them, this is happening with Uncle Billy. I don't like how he makes me feel. And that trusted adult says, oh, Uncle Billy's fine. He's just like that sometimes. You know how much he loves you. Okay? So imagine children receiving those messages about trusted individuals. What happens is the child's lived experience of that truth, of what they know to be true, of what they feel to be true, and then receiving a message that tells them not to believe it or to deny it, messes with your radar. Okay? And if kids aren't feeling protected, or if there's a denial of the reality of the situation, that's when we really start to get into trouble. The good news is that our radar can be repaired. And one of the things that I talk about at Sheena's place in the recovery of an eating disorder, but also helping people learn how to trust their instincts again, is that we need to look at very distinct exercises in order to retrain the mind. Because you have to understand that if trust has been broken, and if people have experienced prolonged pain in the form of, for example, childhood sexual abuse and or physical abuse, these very children that go to school every day and try to function in their everyday lives are having serious consequences from what they're not talking about with people. And it affects memory, your cognition, the speed of your thinking, your ability to be creative, how flexible or rigid you are in your thinking, your ability to concentrate or focus, and actually whether or not you can really have attention, because you might be so distracted by the very things that are happening in your life. So it's really important when we're working with people with disordered eating and we're looking at the disordered eating in the context of a life, these are things that we really need to pay attention to. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the good news is that we can fix our busted radar. And we certainly know this in the literature whenever there's any mention of any kind of brain injury. Okay? We know, and I want to highlight here, that at Sheena's Place, when I'm talking about exercise, I frame it as body movement. Okay? I do not use language like running marathons or going to the gym. I talk about walking. I talk about things that enhance our breathing apparatus so that you're also moving the energy around, but really helping to promote neuron activity, brain growth and development. An author by the name of Norman Deutsch, who's done extensive research in brain development and what happens when the brain can repair itself. These are all things that are so important to incorporate when you're looking at different methods of treatment. Because ultimately, when we're learning how to repair our brain and our radar, we're also teaching ourselves how to self-regulate. Because with the mind, with thinking, also comes feeling. So it is truly, it's not just an intellectual experience that's happening from the neck up. Okay? We have to really have a holistic approach and a framework when we're talking about repairing radar and recovery from an eating disorder. Oh wow, this slide didn't come up. Okay, I'm just going to explain it here. Imagine a triangle. And what that triangle, here, I'm actually going to hold it up right here. So the triangle, this is known as the trifecta of eating disorders. I don't know if you can see it. But over here, there are three concepts that I write about in this trifecta. One is the traumatic event, which I think I've been explaining consistently through this presentation. Then you have to look at the other point of the triangle as the eating disorder. And then the third point is the emotional dysregulation. Okay? That tends to be the relationship of those three phenomena when you think about an eating disorder. Now that's just one trifecta. Again, I don't want to suggest that one size fits all, but certainly a lot of what we see at Sheena's Place, and certainly in my 17 years of running groups, many and most people come having had some adverse life event, which then leads to the emotional dysregulation, having a difficult time managing the consequences from those events, resulting in the development of a disordered eating or an eating disorder, because that becomes the coping mechanism, which unfortunately becomes maladaptive, as a way to manage. So, a little joke about routine. Anyone who's ever worked with me, I cannot overemphasize this enough. Kids thrive with routines, and so do adults. So, you know, we can distract ourselves as much as possible, But at the end of the day, if there's one thing that I constantly get back to with clients is eat, activity, sleep. That's the recipe for babies, okay? And then as kids get older and even as we move into adulthood, we start to create routines in our lives around work, around school, around exercise or body movement, around our social lives or social media. And it's important to have routine because then people can learn to redefine their relationship with food, to see food as fuel, as the very thing we need in order to function. Because as many people have asked me at Sheena's place, you know, so when you get your routine on track and you develop these life skills and you start to open yourself to new relationships, and I've had many people lean forward in group and say, and then? And it's amazing because people are just so accustomed to an eating disorder being such a huge part of their lives. And I want to suggest to you, and what I always tell people at Sheena's place is, and then you can move on with the rest of your life. Because the eating disorder isn't taking up your life anymore. But with routine comes practice. And with routine comes periods of rest and needing to reach out and needing the repetition. Because the brain really responds to repetition. And these are concepts that are really in Psychology 101. You don't need to read lots of books on abnormal psych or eating disorders to understand that in order to get rid of some maladaptive, not great habits, we need to create new ones, but in order to make them entrenched, we need the repetition. My last concept that I'm going to speak about here is something that I've framed and phrased. I phrase it as a Crumb theory. And that is actually just rooted in a story. One of the greatest influences in my life was my maternal grandmother. Her name was Belle, and she lived until the ripe old age of 96, independently on her own, brain intact. She was quite a force. And I remember her asking me about my, when I was getting married, and the man I had met, and she had yet to meet him, and so she wanted me to talk about what he was like. So I was describing certain characteristics and attributes of my partner, and she said, well, does he hurt you? Does he hit you? And I remember looking at her like wide-eyed and shocked, like, no. But, you know, my grandmother was born in the early 1900s, so she got to witness a whole bunch of things that I certainly would not have assumed happening in relationships, but she certainly had seen it. So I reassured her that, no, that wasn't going to be part of my marital experience. And she said, well, and does he make a good living? And I reassured her that yes, my soon-to-be husband was gainfully employed. And that was it. And I remember looking at her and saying, Grandma, don't you want to know if we have things in common? Common interests, how he sees me, how I see him, shared goals, visions, dreams for the future, conversations about kids, social justice, the very things that motivate us as people. And she said, well, honey, you're just lucky if you get X. And I thought, oh, wow. And I reflected on our conversation for many, many years and came up with this notion of Crumb theory. And if you read any books or pieces of literature on the psychology of women, if you look at even Naomi Wolf's text called The Beauty Myth, or if you read Reviving Ophelia, texts that are immersed in really understanding the culture of women and the psychology of women and what women learn to expect from life and or from relationships. What I think my grandmother had internalized and that I was struggling with was this notion of be satisfied for whatever you get. That what my grandmother, I think, was speaking to was based on her own life experiences. Your self-esteem and your confidence might not be so high. So don't think about the cake. Don't dream big. Don't aim high. Don't think about your dream perfect life partner. Just settle. Be happy with X, because that might be all that you get. And I'm raising this here in this presentation because really what I want to suggest to all of you is that we have a long way to go in terms of raising our girls and our boys and helping them to understand that we can all dream big and we can all have expectations of each other. But in order to believe that we have the room to do that, we have to believe that we are deserving enough that we can have the most incredible people in our lives who can be reflections of who we are and how we feel about ourselves. So that's my Crumb theory. Now, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but it's certainly not the end of having some dialogue. And these are some of the questions that Nedic brought to my attention that were being posed online. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask these questions, or I can certainly start with answering some of these. And if people want to type in some of their questions, then I would be more than happy to answer. So one of the questions that was posed is sabotage common in bed, which is binge eating disorder? I want to reframe the word sabotage a little bit and talk about self-harm on a continuum. Because what the word sabotage connotes, or what it might indicate, is that a person is conscious of the ways in which they are hurting themselves. I can tell you that when people really start to examine their binge eating, they're not feeling good about it. And it's often something that happens in hiding, with lots of secrecy and a ton of shame. So if we look at disordered eating on a continuum, understanding that a man, a woman, any person needs to put themselves wherever it is that they are. If you're hurting yourself with food and or dieting and or any of the corollary ways in which you hurt yourself with food, you're hurting yourself. End of story. To use the word sabotage, are you hurting others? Sure. Is it affecting your work life? Most definitely. So I think that it's important to see it more as, wow, this person's clearly struggling. They're hurting themselves with food and the relationship that is happening with food and binge eating. But you have to understand that it is complicated. That terms that used to be used when I was growing up and going to high school, like pigging out, this is very serious. And if you know someone in your life, personally or professionally, who's struggling with this, it's so important to provide non-judgmental support and to make sure that that person knows that there's appropriate help for them to receive. Because I can tell you, even if it's happening for them on the bare minimum, they know that something's not right with what they're doing with food. So we really want to try and have a non-judgmental approach where we're really trying to offer as much support as possible. Do you think that if we reduce the amount of childhood trauma, it could lead to a reduction in eating disorders? Well, I was just talking about this with Marbella. It's very frightening to me when I pick up the newspaper and I see what's happening on college and university campuses. If we look at what's happening in terms of sexual assault to young people. If we look at what's happening on Facebook and the denial, those are insidious messages that are going out to the public every day. As a woman, when I read things like that in the newspaper, and when I absorb that kind of material, and I'm 45 years old, I have to think about all kinds of issues relating to my safety. I start to think about those very issues of safety in relation to my daughter, in relation to all the people we see at Sheena's place. So the short answer, yes. I think we would see not just a reduction in eating disorders, I think we'd see a reduction in all survival strategies and maladaptive coping mechanisms that people develop in response to childhood trauma. And that can include alcoholism, drug use, and understanding too that we see many people at Sheena's place with a concurrent disorder with that combined relationship of difficulties with food and sometimes also having another relationship with alcohol and drugs. Last question here on this page. Will someone recovering from an eating disorder ever accept their body? And does anyone ever really accept their body? I will say this. The lived experience for someone with an eating disorder is complicated and it's multifaceted because it involves, it's physical and it's mental and it's emotional and it's psychological and it's spiritual. Absolutely, every research scientist that's been doing this work in eating disorders forever will tell you about the huge neurological impact on the brain. But, if we live in a world and in a society that consistently sends out messages around what we as men and as women are supposed to look like, and you don't have to go far, you just have to look at a billboard or a magazine, and these are things that people have been struggling with since the beginning of time. I do believe that here we are in 2015, and our world is tough to navigate. And we are seeing more and more young people struggling in colleges and in universities across this country because they are now realizing just how much they have to do. Deal with their school curriculum, navigate social media, maintain their relationships and their friendships, live in residence for the first time, cook a meal, do a load of laundry. Like the amount of juggling is tremendous. And so if you think about all of those pressures and then somehow this notion that we're supposed to look perfect, I think those concepts really interfere with global acceptance of who we are and how we look. And I also want to suggest here that, and I say this in my groups at Sheena's Place, we have to start getting better at complimenting people on who they are and on what they say and on what they do and how they make a difference in our lives. I love telling people in my life how much they mean to me, how what they say and what they do has an impact on my life, that sharing meaningful messages that help people feel valued for who they are, for what they do, not for how they look. To this day, we continue to be bombarded with messaging like every day. Wow, you look so great. Have you lost weight? And I just think that, there's nothing wrong with giving a compliment to someone on their physical appearance, but we have to be broader in our way of helping people feel special. Because I see with young girls and boys that this is still a huge focus.
Okay, so we have 3 questions from our participants in the chat room. First one is coming from Michelle, and it says, how do we coax a 20-year-old with anorexia nervosa to seek treatment when she's in denial? She's depressed, has PTSD, is on wait list for trauma treatment, and we have another 2 years to go. We're in Durham region and we're not sure right now how we can go on.
I'm really glad you wrote. Hang in there. It's going to be so important that you find a place to receive support for yourself, because I can tell you that being a primary caregiver of someone who is living with trauma and trauma-based sequelae, being disordered eating is just so huge. Reach out to organizations like NEDIC, like Sheena's Place, like NEED, N-I-E-D, who can provide you with other support from other people who are living with the very experience that you are. You can't do this in isolation. No one can do this alone. And as much as is humanly possible to do, just, you gotta love your kid for who they are, understand that what's going on for them right now is so tremendous, and that they're ill. And so when someone is also hugely underweight, and when they haven't been weight restored, and when they're also dealing with PTSD, it's a very frightening time. Read as much as you can, get as much support as you can. Waiting lists are a huge problem. But again, there are organizations like Sheena's Place, like NEDIC, like NEED, and sometimes it's true you have to travel to get the help that's going to be right for you. I can tell you that at Sheena's Place we see people as far away as Kingston who take the train to join our parent-partner support groups. So I hope that helps you, and just please know that you're not alone in what you're going through, and it's going to be so important for you to get support for yourself.
Okay, so the second question that we have is, do families cause eating disorders?
The short answer, no. You know, we don't want to create blame. And I can tell you that if the experience was one of cancer, we would never say that a family caused that cancer. We might talk about genetic predisposition. We might talk about a history of mental health factors in a family. But to use the word blame suggests that there are X amount of people who are inherently responsible for causing Y. And it just doesn't work like that. As a parent, I can tell you that there's no perfect script to raising a child, and it takes a village. That overused statement around how families need tons of support. And that I think it's really important that people understand that it's not a linear relationship, this development of an eating disorder. What I see happen a lot, and I hear from parents, is that when they try to talk about it with friends or relatives who don't understand eating disorders, there's so many assumptions that are made about, well, what did you do? Or how did you cause this? And you have to understand, when we think about global mental health, not just eating disorders, but anxiety, depression, difficulties with maintaining attention, these are all things that occur in the brain. And so when we're thinking about, recovery and treatment, it has to incorporate a framework that involves medical, psychological, social, sometimes medication. And it's, again, as I said earlier, one size does not fit all. We also have to start thinking outside of the box when it comes to working with people with eating disorders, because everyone is unique in their presentation, in their lived experience of having disordered eating, and I just think we need to move away from this blame paradigm into one that has a bit more compassion and understanding.
And the last question that we have is, What impact do you think health professionals who are unfamiliar with eating disorders have on promoting or maintaining eating disorders?
Okay. Very good question. People who are not trained in this field can have a huge detrimental impact on people. Please, I implore anyone out there who's watching this who is new to this field, this is not simply an issue of why don't you just eat and you just need to try harder. Okay? Some of the biggest myths and misconceptions revolve around this very serious illness. So what I would encourage you to do is to read as much as possible by written pieces of literature by people like Dr. Gail McVeigh, Dr. Debbie Katzman, Dr. Blake Woodside, Dr. Alan Kaplan, Ann Kerr, people who are leaders and pioneers in this field who've been doing this work for over 30 years. And they will tell you that there are very specific needs for this population, and it is so important that you educate yourself. We're seeing big problems happening now in emergency departments across the country because well-intentioned healthcare providers are just sometimes saying things that are causing more harm than good. So again, this is a very big shout out to people. Educate yourself. And there are people out there who can train you. Just reach out and ask.
Okay, so that's all we have for questions. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your days to join us here at NEDIC, and of course to thank Debbie for sharing her knowledge and her passion in the community and for teaching us about Juicy Love, Busted Radar, and Crumb Theory. Just a reminder for all the viewers in Toronto, Sheena's Place has a lot of fun events going on during Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Oh no, the week of February 1st through 7th. Sorry, just need to sign back in. The computer logged us out.
There we go.
And on Tuesday, they're hosting an open house February 3rd from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And on Saturday, February 7th, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., Sheena's Place is hosting a free workshop by Victoria Freeman on cultivating supportive relationships with others and with yourself. So Sheena's Place is located at 87 Spadina Road, and there's their website and phone number there if you'd like to get in touch. Just a reminder for everyone that all of these slides and the presentation is recorded, and it's going to be sent out to all of the participants here today. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.